comparative analysis of Brazilian economic success. I want to start by reading a Samuel Huntington quote that says, "Corruption provides immediate, specific, and concrete benefits to groups which might otherwise be thoroughly alienated from society. Corruption may thus be functional to the maintenance of political system in the same way that reform is." And that's essentially what my research is all about. So the puzzle, why did I choose this? I am from Brazil, and I moved to the US, and when I lived in Brazil, the narrative over there was about corruption and corruption scandals, and on the media, that's all it was about. And when I moved to the US, it was about how the Brazilian economy was booming. So it was two completely different narratives. And so in my research, I attempt to shed light on the following questions. Number one, how does a country with such a high level of political corruption become an economic powerhouse in Latin America? And the second question is, how can corruption be functional? Because as political scientists, we believe that corruption, to put in the simplest terms possible, is really, really bad. And we don't see it as a good thing or as functional. So I am testing for the correlation of economic development and political corruption. Okay, so I read a lot of literature on corruption, and if you're a political science major, you probably heard about James C. Scott. He has a lot on corruption, and in his article about corruption in developing nations, he said that one must ask of corruption the same questions one asks of any political process. Who gets what, when, and how? And that's what I'm trying to answer in my paper, although that's a big question to answer in 3 months. So I'm hypothesizing that political corruption in Brazil is used as a coping mechanism in the bureaucratic government, who's many times inefficient, but it still works. And in other words, to get things done in Brazil, there needs to be a level of corruption. I know that sounds terrible, but I'm going to try to explain. And I put this quote here on the bottom because it's very Brazilian, you know. So it says, dismissing the corruption charges of their political leaders, with the Brazilians saying, "rouba mas faz," which means he steals but get things done. And a lot of the literature that I read said that if a country is doing economically well, it's growing, voters are usually, many times, they tend to look away and turn to the other side and not focus so much on corruption. But that has been changing as well in Brazil, and I'm going to get into that. Okay, so corruption and economic growth. Different ways in which corruption is functional. So the debate on corruption being functional, or political corruption being functional, is very, very fervent, to say the least. And here is a quote by Mauro Paulo. He wrote about corruption growth. And he says that corruption may raise economic growth through two types of mechanisms. First, corrupt practices as speed money would enable individuals to avoid bureaucratic delay. And second, the government employees who are allowed to levy bribes would work harder. The most prevalent and common types of corruption in Brazil is, usually there are two forms of presidential abuse of power, and those are very common in Brazil. The first is the exchange of resources for political support, and the second is the sale of government services, privileges, exceptions, information, and so on to citizens by government officials. So government officials selling those services that is illegal, and therefore it's corrupt in the strictest sense possible. Illegal actions undertaken by government officials to enrich themselves, raise campaign funds, which in the US is a form of lobbying. In Brazil, that's huge too. Or by support among legislators or interest groups. In Brazil, the most prevalent and common type of corruption includes overpricing, which in the economy of the country, which is artificially increasing the prices of goods and services, the facilitation of payments in the form of bribes, illegal fundraising for campaign contributions, and favoring the elites, profiting from privilege of information, facilitation of contracts, and manipulations of regulations, which is huge. You know, there's a law, but we say, oh, let's do it the Brazilian way. Maybe we can bend it if we don't break it. There's a lot of bending, a lot of rules and laws in Brazil. And the biggest of all, which we've seen recently, is the use of public money for private purposes. in 2012, there was a huge corruption trial in Brazil. The right hand of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, which was the former president, he was caught stealing money. It was the Mensalão trials, which was really one of the largest political corruption trials ever in Brazil. And it was huge, it was in the media, it was everywhere. And that was the first time that it was really big, and we saw it very transparent. It was out there. So we see that there is corruption happening, it's growing, it's not slowing down. And the next slide, I'm going to talk about the economic growth. So we can see that there's two things happening in Brazil that's very interesting. There is corruption and economic growth happening at the same time. And many economists says that usually corruption slows down or harms economic growth and investments and all of that stuff. And in Brazil, we're kind of the opposite. You know, it's growing and there is more than ever people are investing in Brazil. So it's really interesting. So the graph on the left shows poverty and inequality. The blue line represents the population living below poverty, and the brown line shows the Gini coefficient. In both, you can see have decreased dramatically from 1990 to 2009. The graph on the right shows the GDP of the country, which has been growing at an annual rate of 1.7% since the 1990s. And although Brazil is in a continuous fight against poverty, against corruption, as you can see, economically, it is growing. Brazil's overall wealth has grown, as has the GDP, which has grown from 3.2 in 2005, 3.7 in 2006, 5.3 in 2007, and in 2010, it finally reached 7.5, which, you know, it illustrates Brazil's remarkable growth, over 50% in a period of 5 years, which that is huge for a corrupt country like Brazil. The GDP increase of 7.5 in 2010 placed Brazil ahead of Britain and France, becoming the 5th largest economy in the world. In the past 5 years, about 34 million Brazilians entered the middle class. This, for a population of around 200 million, is very significant, guys. Brazil is not just a commodity story, but a very strong domestic story. Today, over 52% of the country's population is in the middle class, and all of this happened, all this economic growth happened in the presence of corruption. So I'm still working on my conclusion for this, but I'm trying to answer that question. I don't think 3 months is enough, but I'm trying really hard. I also, in order to show the significance of my findings, I had to compare with Argentina, which they went through a terrible, and as you can see, every graph shows a dramatic decline. They went through a terrible economic crisis in the same time that Brazil went, in the early 2000s. However, Brazil picked it up and recovered, right away. And till today, as you can see, 2012, the value of pesos, which is the Argentine currency, is still suffering. So, I compared. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I only have 2 minutes left. But in my paper, if you guys want to read it, I'll send it to you guys. So there has been a history of resiliency in Brazil. Curveballs are thrown, showing slowing down the country in every sector. What I talked a lot about in my paper was where money was being invested. And, in Brazil, it's either going to the pockets of politicians, or as many of you heard, we have the World Cup right now in 2014, a couple of months, and then we have the Olympics in 2016. And it's a really big dilemma, where we should be investing in education or healthcare and all of that. We're investing in soccer fields? I mean, I love soccer, don't get me wrong, but, and that's where we go from here. I mean, where do we go from here? The Brazilian institutional setting is corrupt, but somehow it still functions, and it does not impede the economic growth of the country. Although it does slow it down, I haven't been able to prove how corruption slows it down, but it does. Like any economic theory will show, it does slow it down. Nevertheless, there is no causal link found between economic growth and corruption. Thus, my hypothesis is negated due to the shortage of evidence proving that corruption is functional and aids in the economic growth of Brazil. And last year, I just wanted to close with a little something. Last year, we had one of the largest protests seen since the 80s. And it was huge. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians hit the streets in many cities. And it wasn't just about, you know, the World Cup and the investing money in the World Cup. It was a lot of political things that I don't really have time to talk about. But I really like this picture up here that says the giant woke up. You know, the giant being Brazil. We woke up, we're out there in the streets, and it was just beautiful. And even in Orlando, I went to Orlando for the weekend, and there were protests, Brazilian protests in Orlando. So it was huge, you know? And I want to close with my acknowledgments. I wanted to thank my professor, my research advisor, Dr. Husky, for challenging me, always asking me for more data, even when I looked at every data possible. And thankful for the wise words of Dr. Nyland, answering my emails right away, the same day that's really unusual, but he always got back to me. In this university and my friends and my senior research class, you guys have been great. And my mom, she's not here, but she's going to be seeing this. Without her, this wouldn't be possible. But that's it.